Okay, well, I provided an explainer for Brasilia just because I thought that it might be interesting for people to actually see the city if you haven't been there. I'd never been there, and I've always found that gentleman to be a good explainer of just about anything. Your book, Smart Enough City, has a whole section in the conclusion about high modernism in city planning and architecture to kind of drive home the point that over planning along rational lines can lead to problems. And so, based on what was shown in the video, as well as what Green wrote about, um, what do we learn from that example and some of the other examples regarding, highly planned cities from that era? Well, one of the things that leapt out at me was that Brasilia was supposed to be a city that kind of showcased Brazil's, you know, future, its hopes for its future, for a better life for people. But because they didn't really factor in the social and economic dynamics involved in actually building the city, they ended up producing a city that actually showcased the class division and in which an awful lot of people lived on the outskirts in shanty towns. And so visitors to this capital city would get an eyeful of the actual economic dynamics of Brazil. Um, Now, from my perspective, that's not necessarily bad because when people are really confronted with gross inequality, I mean, that's really the only hope that you have that the people will actually want to fix the problem. And I'm not saying it had that effect. However, in a lot of cases, cities are planned to keep that effect at a distance. For instance, when you drive through Houston on the highway, you're not going to see 98% of the homeless population problem there. But indeed, if you go around that highway to get to the airport and go on city streets and look underneath the highway, for instance, then you see a very different Houston. All right. So anyway, like it was an unintended consequence that they certainly didn't want for Brasilia. Um, and then also, I just want to emphasize the point that Green makes that the highly rational planning of cities like Brasilia can lead people to reject them. Like to this day, there's not a snappy social life in Brazil. It's not where things are happening. It's kind of reminded me on Topeka on a smaller scale, of course. Topeka is an example of this. I don't even know if Topeka was planned, but I feel like capital cities have a hard time for some reason. If you go to Topeka or Springfield, Illinois would be another example. It's like there wasn't a whole lot of attention being paid to the city being sort of a cultural hotspot. And as a result, it almost feels empty, especially downtown. Um, Now, how do these projects reject democracy? Well, this is a pretty straightforward situation. Um, in all of these cases of high modernism in planning and architecture that he discusses, the decision making was all top down. It was literally, individual planner down or designer down. Um, so, the in the mind of the visionary architect and planner, straight lines or, spokes or, evenly spaced buildings and things like that, that catch the sunlight at certain angles. All of that makes total sense from the point of view of design, but they didn't actually seem to ask people along the way as they came up with these designs. They didn't necessarily study how people actually interact with planned streets and architecture like they were developing. There was an overconfidence and a sort of strange, tech goggles before there was too much tech, in the bedazzlement of these grand visions. And you'll notice in a lot of cases, at least at first, these great, architects and designers like Corbusier's, work was largely like considered like kind of like the high fashion that you see in women's fashion magazines. Nice to look at on paper, but not going to buy at any price because so uncomfortable and expensive. And yet, over time, these cities were planned and built. And furthermore, their design concepts, in part, were replicated in an awful lot of cities, sometimes with not so great results. The U.S. government for a while subsidized and sponsored a lot of high-rise buildings for turnkey residents, people who were we hope to be lifted out of poverty, who were on welfare, who were looking for work. And the architecture was supposed to be so like fuel efficient and just, rational to hold a good number of people for the lowest cost possible. Well, I mean, real human beings in that situation, they get the message from the architecture, you are not important, right? So like a lot of those buildings ended up being razed after they got trashed and nobody was taking care of them, including the cities that were supposed to keep them up. And eventually they either became abandoned or got torn down. Um, so, you know, are technocrats who make these decisions right? That people don't know what they need, that they need to sort of be guided from above and have their tastes and preferences and behavior changed? Well, I mean, ultimately, it's a human thing, right? So whether they're right or not about in their judgment about what people need, if people aren't open to these developments, it doesn't matter. And I think that this is the big lesson to draw from this. Also, Green highlights the example of forest planning in Germany. Recall that. Just, here Mother Nature is rebelling, right? Like the Germans decided that actual old growth forests that had planted themselves were inefficient from the point of view of harvesting for fuel. So they started to plant their own forests and, the species that grew the fastest and straight lines and so on and so forth. Uh, and of course, along the way, they got rid of whole ecosystems that depended upon the variety and diversity of the previous landscape. So, as the book says, early on, those forests thrived. The trees grew really big, they harvested a lot of wood, but within a fairly short period of time, they were not and actually started to die. And the Germans had to learn the lesson that nature knows best what it's doing when it comes to growing trees. There's probably a happy medium, and I think that we do grow a lot of trees in a planned way now. But we learn from those types of lessons. But here was a case of people not listening, so to speak, to nature itself, not really observing. And the crazy thing is, Germans were sort of at the forefront of ecology to a certain extent, believe it or not. And there were those among them who understood the cyclical nature of an environment like a forest. And yet the impulse to, organize and systematize and make into sort of factory-like scene a forest was just the pull was too strong, both because of the wood shortage, but also because of people's nature, right? Like their tendency, at least in the modern world, to want everything to be systematic and predictable. So it failed because nature is not systematic and extremely predictable. Um, but we do know that, the multiplicity of species in a huge chain of life is a real thing. And that when you pull one thread, other threads that you didn't even know about in the soil, from the soil on up, are disrupted. And so that happened to the Germans. Another lesson learned. So I don't need to say a whole lot more. I just wanted to drive home the big points that Green is trying to make.